This is a brand new Traxxas Revo 3.3, and if you've ever wanted to run Nitro without blowing it up or giving up, this is your guide. While very complex, the Revo 3.3 is also one of the easiest Nitros to use and one of the most fun Nitros to bash. Between its crazy amount of suspension travel and these giant soft tires, this thing can go over pretty much any terrain. But of course, you know we're gonna make it even better with some awesome upgrades I got from A-Main, including this beautiful OS21TM engine. The stock Traxxas 3.3 engine is pretty good, but this OS21TM is on another level. But before we install it, in order for you to be successful with Nitro, you need to know how Nitro works. This is RC nitromethane fuel. It's about 20% nitromethane, 12% oil, and the rest is mostly methanol. But why are those ingredients in there, and how do we turn this liquid into moving an RC car? From the outside, we can see we have a carburetor. This is where the air goes into the engine and where the fuel goes into the engine. We have the crankcase. This is where the air and fuel originally go in. It also supports the crankshaft. We have the cylinder. This is where the piston rides up and down. It also has the exhaust port where spent gases come out. And then we have the cylinder head, which is responsible for most of the cooling of the engine and contains the glow plug, which goes right down in here. Pulling this head off will give us a closer look at the heart of the engine. If you do pull one of these apart, be very, very careful. Everything must stay completely clean. One bit of grit inside this engine can destroy it. And also make sure you keep track of the little head shims that go between the head and the engine, as they need to go back in place where they came from. But with that head off, we can see the piston, which is responsible for most of the functions inside this engine. To see the rest of it, let's go ahead and pull this back plate off as well. Again, I want to stress that you make sure your tools and your workspace are very clean if you're going to take an engine apart. Cleanliness is super important for these things. Also, don't be too concerned as you see me take this apart. For normal use on a basher, you probably will never have to take the engine apart, but it is possible. Looking here in the back, you can see there's a rod that connects to the crankshaft, which is the part that actually outputs the power in a spinning motion, and that rod translates the up and down motion of the piston into the spinning motion of the crankshaft. So how exactly does this work? It's actually pretty simple. You've got a hole here in the top that air comes through. That same crankshaft has a slot in it that opens and closes to allow that air in. That slot goes straight through to this hole, and when the piston goes up, it creates a negative pressure inside here, which is what draws that air in. That air mixes with fuel in the carburetor, which we'll talk about more in a second, and then when that piston comes back down, it pressurizes the inside of this crankcase, which will then push that air and fuel into the cylinder through these ports as soon as they open. Once that air and fuel is in there, the ports are going to close up, this is going to squish together, and then the air-fuel mixture will fire. The expansion of that air-fuel mixture pushes the piston down, and the exhaust gets blown right out the exhaust port, right out here. This is known as a two-stroke engine, so that entire process happens every single time the piston goes up and down. Now, of course, the carburetor also plays a big role in how the engine works, but surprisingly, so does the exhaust. Because this has a combustion event every time it rotates, we have the exhaust and intake open at the same time. To prevent that intake charge from blowing straight out the exhaust, this is specifically shaped to return some pressure back into the cylinder at just the right time. That timing dramatically affects how powerful the engine is and when it's powerful, which is where we get terms such as power band and coming up on the pipe. We'll dig deeper into how the carburetor works when we get to tuning, but for now, let's get this thing on the truck. As we pull this old engine out, I can show you one of the biggest advantages to the Revo over some other Nitro options, and that's going to be the Easy Start right here. This Easy Start is an electric start for the Nitro engine, and combined with this remote glow plug igniter and this Easy Start wand that goes right here in the back, it makes starting the engine a lot easier than a pull start would be, and it saves your hands from getting blisters if you have any problems getting it started. Now, along with the Easy Start, they also give you a fuel bottle, a charger, an extra air filter, a bunch of extra hardware, including extra body clips, an awesome long travel suspension kit, an extra glow plug, the most comprehensive toolkit I've ever seen in an RC car, some extra shock oil, of course a full manual, and the real kicker is you get this TQI remote with reverse and a built-in Bluetooth module. As far as I know, this is the only Traxxas that comes with the Bluetooth module from the factory, and it shows some pretty cool stuff on the engine. All this stuff you get is one of the big advantages of the Revo. Really, the only thing you have to buy additionally is fuel, and that makes things a lot more simple. The only real downside to all this fancy Easy Start equipment is it makes this engine incompatible with most standard Nitro engines. The OS21TM is one of those compatible engines, and I believe there are a few others still around, but the OS really is the best option if you want to upgrade this 3.3, which again, you don't absolutely have to do. Now with those screws out, this should lift right up out of here, but it's actually still being held in by a couple of sensor wires. Those sensor wires include a cylinder head temperature sensor as well as an RPM sensor. Normally I would just disconnect these, but let's go ahead and swap them over to the OS 21 so I can show you how it works. Another thing you may have noticed is that I disconnected two hoses. Both of these go to the fuel tank. This one goes from the fuel tank to the carburetor to deliver fuel to the engine, but this one goes from the exhaust back into the fuel tank, and it actually pressurizes the fuel tank to push that fuel into the carburetor. While we have the original engine out, is the best time to go ahead and do the rest of the upgrades. While not completely necessary, these parts that I picked up from A-Main, including the axle shafts, a center differential, the rear brake kit, and these links are going to make this truck more reliable and more fun to bash. The first big upgrade we're going to do is to this transmission. And to do that, we're going to be breaking some rules. One of the coolest features of the Revo is that this transmission has reverse in it, and unfortunately, now that I'm looking at it, I don't think we are going to be able to break the rules. The plan was to install this center differential, but keep reverse. ChatGPT told me it would work, but as you can see, this differential actually takes the place of the reverse shifter, and I definitely want to keep reverse, so we're not going to put the center differential in. As you can see, reverse works by this clutch moving back and forth, and it either selects the gears down there, or this direct drive gear to drive the output, which lets it either turn clockwise or counterclockwise, giving us reverse. I wanted to install that center differential because this drivetrain isn't the strongest in the world, and the center differential helps decouple the front and rear of the drivetrain, reducing shock loads that pass through it. But like I said, I think reverse is more important, so we're just going to keep it like it is. This is also a 2-speed transmission, which uses a little centrifugal weight inside one of the gears to shift back and forth between the gears depending on how fast things are spinning, and it has this sensor for what's known as the OptiDrive system. OptiDrive is pretty cool. It uses that sensor to determine whether or not the truck is moving, and if it is moving, it won't let you shift between forward and reverse, because shifting when you're moving puts a huge shock load on everything and can really destroy stuff quickly. The only downside is this OptiDrive system is fairly problematic. Fortunately, if you ever have any problems with it, you can just take it out, as bypassing it doesn't really do anything other than remove that forward reverse and reverse forward protection. Fortunately, the Revo does have a decent slipper clutch, which at least helps protect the drivetrain from shock loads from the engine, and vice versa. So we're just going to put this right back where it came from, and hopefully everything will be just fine. One thing I know we're going to be able to install are these beastie steel drive shafts. Out of the box, they're plastic, and I'm not sure they're going to be able to handle the additional torque of that OS engine. This is going to be pretty straightforward. First, we just need to take the front bumper off. By the way, one nice thing this truck comes with are these beautiful upgraded GTR shocks. These are even nicer than the ones that came on the eRevo 2.0 because they've got the Teflon coated bodies, and if you look down in there, they've got the titanium nitride coated shafts. They're not a huge deal, but they sure are nice. To get that axle out, we just need to pull this upper hinge pin out, and then remove the grub screw pin from the inside, as well as from the 17mm hex on the outside. And now we can just pull that straight out of there. Installation is the reverse of removal, and there we go, that looks much better. Now we just need to change out this link. We're going to swap it out for the one that came on the last version of the eRevo 2.0. As you can see, they're the same link, but this one's much beefier. And this corner is done and looking way better. Let me get the other 3 corners done off camera, and then let's get this engine mounted up. But first, we need to take off the parts from the old engine that we need. That's going to include this temperature sensor from the head, the motor mount from underneath, and the Easy Start system from the back. This Easy Start system gets a bad reputation, but it's mostly because people don't take care of them properly. There are just a few maintenance items on these Easy Start systems that really need to be kept up with, and if you don't keep up with them, it can cause problems that people will end up blaming on the system that really aren't the system's fault. Those problems are primarily related to this one-way bearing. If this thing dries out or gets dirty, it can jam up and not work properly, and you need that one-way bearing to be able to start the motor, but be able to have the motor free spin on its own once it's running. These contacts can also get loose and dirty. Keeping them clean and tight helps a lot for getting the power to this motor. The contacts on the chassis can also tarnish and wear over time. The connector that the Easy Start goes into can see a lot of abuse, and this thing can wear out. Fortunately, this harness is only like $10, and I do consider it to be a wear item that should be replaced occasionally. And then finally, the battery in the Easy Start wand itself can go bad. A lot of these cars have been around a long time, and people will try to use a battery that's 10 or 12 years old to run the Easy Start, and it just doesn't work well. In my experience, if you keep those few things in good condition, the Easy Start system will work just fine, and it's really, really convenient to have. The only other thing we're going to need off this is the flywheel and clutch. Generally speaking, especially when the motor is new, this is going to be pretty straightforward to remove, though there are quite a few little pieces you need to keep track of, including spacers and bearings. You also want to pay attention to the orientation of these clutch shoes, as they need to go back on the same way they came off. And then once you've loosened this nut, it should come right off of here. The flywheel itself is on a tapered seat, so it might require a couple taps with a soft-faced mallet. Just give it a couple taps like that with this sitting in something like a vise, and then that should come right off too. They do make pullers for these if you want to go that route as well. well. We're also going to need this little tapered collet, and all this is going to transfer right over to the new OS21TM. I was going to go ahead and mount up this RPM sensor, but unfortunately the OS engine uses a different shape of tab right here for mounting. We could probably modify this, but the RPM sensor isn't really that useful anyway, so we're going to leave it off. The last thing we need to put on before we slap it in the chassis is this exhaust manifold. The OS engine uses a different exhaust manifold mounting flange as the stock engine, so it comes with its own header. Hooking on its associated spring retainer is nearly impossible on the truck, so it's best to do that part before you install it. And now we can install this beautiful blue beast back in the chassis. Just like that. Now let me get the wiring buttoned up on this and let's go make some noise. All right, so it makes noise and that's awesome, but we need to take a few steps back here because that startup was the most important startup of this engine's life. That's because it starts what's known as the break-in procedure. This fuel the engine's running on has nitromethane, methanol, and oil in it. That oil goes in with the fuel and actually lubricates the engine, and during the break-in process, that lubrication is absolutely critical. It's critical because these nitro engines actually depend on an interference fit between the cylinder and the piston for the compression, and that interference fit is really tight when the engine's new. As the piston is moving up and down, it's making clearance between the piston and the cylinder, which is what seats them together, which is what creates optimal running in the long run. The break-in procedure essentially makes sure there's enough oil everywhere and that everything stays at the proper temperature for that break-in action to happen. And this is why there's a million different break-in procedures, because nobody actually knows what the proper break-in procedure is, because it changes based on what engine you have and the tolerances of the engine when it was built. The only real goal of the break-in procedure is to make sure you have enough lubrication and the proper temperature to make sure that bedding in happens properly. There are a bunch of different procedures you can follow, but primarily it starts out with making sure your carburetor is set properly for break-in. The manual is going to give you some instructions on how to set these little screws here and here. Sometimes there might be one over here as well, but for the most part you can actually ignore this needle over here unless you get really advanced in tuning. Usually the needle at the top here where the fuel comes in is your main jet needle, and the needle over here in the middle of the slide is your idle jet needle. The main jet needle controls how much fuel flows into the carburetor and into the engine at all times, but it mostly affects high throttle running. The idle jet needle mostly affects how much fuel is going in at idle and part throttle. There is one more screw, it's usually back here. This is your idle speed adjustment. As you open and close the throttle, it moves a little slide in there, which allows more or less air in, also pulling more or less fuel in. This idle speed adjustment screw just sets how much gap you have down in there when it's all the way at its physical closed stop. Typically that gap needs to be 1 millimeter to 1.5 millimeters, though for break-in you might need to tweak that a little bit, although you can also just adjust the throttle on the controller to keep it running, because this is going to be really rich, meaning there's going to be a lot more fuel to air than it normally would need, and that can sometimes make it hard to idle. There's one more thing you need to do before you start your engine for the first time, and that's to read the owner's manual. A Nitro owner's manual is even more important than the owner's manual on an electric RC car, because it explains most of the things that I've told you in this video, and it may even cover some stuff that I forgot, so definitely read your manual. This is obviously going to be the second start, but it's basically the exact same as if it was your first start. You want to have the car with the tires off on a cardboard box. I've got the front of this car held up in the air because the exhaust manifold kind of tips up. Oil is going to collect and spit out of the back of this exhaust, so you want to have it tipped up so that the oil has someplace to go and doesn't just pool up in the muffler. Take your fuel and your fuel bottle, dunk the fuel bottle down in the fuel, give it a squeeze, and the fuel will come right out of that fuel into your fuel bottle. Then you're just going to go ahead and fill up your fuel tank. Your fuel tank size is going to vary depending on what kind of car you have, which is why I think having a set amount of tanks you use for run-in, it really doesn't make a lot of sense. Before you get started, you're going to need the following things. Of course, your transmitter. In the case of a Traxxas, your start stick with a charged battery. If you don't have a pull start, you're going to need your glow igniter, which goes into the glow plug, a tuning screwdriver to fine-tune the adjustment on the carburetor, and then an infrared thermometer, or you can just use the Traxxas Link app if you've got one of these cars. Now, while this is not absolutely required, I very highly recommend either having a heat gun or a hair dryer. Preheating the engine up to about 160 or 180 degrees Fahrenheit is going to make first start really easy, and subsequent starts much easier on the engine. Before you start, you're going to need to prime the engine to get fuel into the carburetor. The easiest way to do that is just to put your finger over the exhaust and either give it a few pulls or give it a few spins with the easy start. Now you're ready to start. I have the multifunction knob on the TQI remote set to where I can adjust the throttle with it. But if you don't have that, you can always hold a little bit of throttle with the transmitter. With this thing being so tight, it's probably going to be hard to start at normal idle right off the bat. So having a little extra throttle can be helpful. Now, once you have it running, your goal is to keep it running at a medium to high idle for the entire fuel tank. It might be hard to keep running at first simply because it's very tight and very new, but you just want to keep it running. If you have to increase the idle a little bit, that's just fine. Your other goal is to keep the temperature of the engine between about 180 degrees Fahrenheit and 220 degrees Fahrenheit. You might need a little bit of a fan to cool it down, or you might need to put some aluminum foil around the engine head to keep it warmer, but you want to keep it in that temperature range. When that tank's almost empty, you want to go ahead and shut it off. I'm going to do that by pinching the fuel line. And then you want to make sure that the engine is not up at top dead center. You can take the little flywheel down here and just make sure it's loose and free. If it ends up at top dead center with it hot, it could actually get stuck once it cools off and pinches down on that piston. Once you're done with that cycle, you want to let the engine cool all the way down to nearly room temperature, and then you're going to do the cycle again. How many of those cycles you do is kind of up to you. I like to do 2 or 3. Once you're done with that, we can move on to the next step, which is the fun part. While that's burbling, smoking, and dripping away, let's talk about what I think is the coolest part of a nitro engine, and that's the glow plug. The glow plug is what's actually responsible for ignition in the engine. This is different from a glow plug on a diesel engine, which is just used to preheat the chamber for initial ignition. This is responsible for ignition every single combustion event. How it works when you first start the engine is very simple. You're just passing a current through a coil, which glows and ignites the fuel-air mixture. However, the magic comes in when you take the glow starter off, because it continues to glow and not because of heat. This fuel has a bunch of methanol in it, and this glow plug wire is coated in platinum. Platinum creates what's known as a catalytic reaction with methanol and actually self-ignites. The methanol in the fuel and the platinum on this is what keeps the glow plug glowing when the engine's running. This is also one of the most common failure modes of a glow plug, because that platinum coating can wear off over time, or if you buy a cheap glow plug, maybe it's not even going to be there at all. And when that happens, the engine will run fine on the glow starter, but as soon as you take the glow starter off, it'll stop running. I've now run the engine through a few full tank cycles at idle, making sure we're at the stock carburetor settings and making sure we're also spitting a nice amount of oil out the exhaust the entire time. Now we get to have some fun, but before we do, there's one more important safety thing we need to check. If something fails in the receiver or transmitter, the engine could end up at wide open throttle, and that's a really bad situation. So what we want to do is make sure our fail safes are working. To do that, first we're going to make sure our transmitter is on, make sure our receiver is on, then we're going to hold full throttle on the transmitter and turn the transmitter off. See how it actually puts on the brakes? That's what you want to see happen, or at least that it lets the throttle off. That'll prevent a runaway in case the receiver loses signal from the transmitter. The other safety feature that I think is important, but not all cars have, is a return spring on the servo. That way, if you lose power to the car, the servo will slowly return to idle. That return spring's right here on the Revo. If you don't have one on your car, you can always add one, or add a couple of rubber bands to create one. Now it's time to have fun, so let's get some tires on this thing and get it moving. The next few steps are pretty straightforward. Basically, we're just going to go up to quarter throttle, going to let it idle back down, up to quarter throttle, let it idle back down, and we're going to do this over and over through an entire tank of fuel. This is going to help ease into breaking in the truck under load, breaking in the engine under load, and it's going to make a nice, smooth break-in process. You want to do a full tank at quarter throttle, just driving back and forth like this, keeping the carburetor at those really rich settings so there's plenty of lubrication. Once you've done a full tank, you're going to want that engine to cool down again, just like it did at idle. Then do another full tank at half throttle, and then we're going to do another full tank at full throttle, doing the exact same thing. While I finish up those break-in runs, let's talk about tuning, because that's going to be coming next. Tuning your carburetor is the hardest part of running nitro and kind of the dark art of it. On its face, what you're trying to do is very simple. The goal is to get the correct amount of air and the correct amount of fuel into the engine at any given time. How that's done is by adjusting these needles here, and sometimes over here, but you can usually ignore this one. This is your main needle and this is your idle needle, and both of these restrict the amount of fuel that can flow through the carburetor at any given time. The idle needle controls the flow of fuel from 0 throttle to about 1/4 throttle, and then the main needle takes over all the way out to full throttle. One thing to keep in mind though is that all the fuel flows through the main needle, so adjusting it also affects your idle mixture. Other things that affect the mixture are going to be temperature, humidity, whether Mercury's in retrograde, and a bunch of other factors. Ultimately though, this is what makes it so complicated. These engines are small and very sensitive to minor tuning changes, and so again, tuning is kind of an art. By default, the carburetor is set very rich. That's what we've been doing for the break-in process, and when we tune it, we're going to be making it a little bit less rich by turning the main jet needle in and turning the idle jet needle in. The main jet needle is going to very slowly get incrementally turned in until you get good crisp throttle response when you go to full throttle. Nice acceleration, but you're still getting a good stream of blue smoke coming out of the exhaust, and your temperatures are reasonable. Temperatures can be difficult to predict though, because all engines are going to be different. It depends on ambient temperature. It depends on what thermometer you're using. And so a lot of people don't even worry about the temperature. And they say as long as you're getting that steady stream of blue smoke out the exhaust and it's running well, then it's tuned properly. When you are tuning, you want to do very, very small adjustments and then try it, make another small adjustment, try it again. One mistake a lot of people make is they'll say, okay, I want to go in here and make this leaner, and then they'll turn it 1/4 of a turn. That is a huge amount of adjustment, and it'll get you in trouble pretty quickly. Make tiny little adjustments and see how they work. Once you get that main needle adjusted to where you're happy, I usually go a little bit on the rich side, so maybe acceleration isn't quite as good and there's not quite as much top end power, but that's up to you. You can then adjust the idle needle, and there are a bunch of different ways to adjust this. Typically what I do is I start to lean it out from that full rich position, giving it some throttle and letting off. You want the throttle to go up and then come down straight to a single idle. Again though, very tiny increments on this screw. One thing you want to avoid doing is making a bunch of adjustments to your idle speed screw. Where a lot of people get into trouble is they try to make their idle work properly by just opening that idle gap further and further, and you'll usually end up with your carburetor all messed up if you do that. The idle gap you want, it will be in the manual, and typically it's about 1 millimeter, and from there you adjust your idle quality with your idle mixture and a little bit with your main jet, because again, it affects everything. Now I'm not going to get any further into tuning because I could literally talk about it all day and still not tell you everything. There are tons of videos that are specifically about nitro tuning, as well as resources and flowcharts you can find online. I'd recommend watching a few of those to get some really specific tuning help. But the most important thing I want to leave you with on tuning is if you get in trouble, if things start not running right, just go back to those base default settings and start over again. It's really easy to go too far in one of these or go the wrong direction, not realize it, and be way out of whack and just have no idea what's going on. But now this thing's ready to bash, so let's go have some fun with it. And when we come back, I'm going to give you every tip I know to make sure your engine lasts as long as possible. What I have on here is what I would consider a safe, rich tune. This engine's still kind of getting broken in, and I don't want to go too lean with it just yet, because I want to protect everything and make sure it gets plenty of lubrication while things are still freed up a little bit. But we've got it lean enough where we can get some good action out of it, take it around and bash it and have fun while it finishes its break-in. We went ahead and did the 1/4, half, and full throttle tanks, and now we can have some fun with it while it finishes up. This thing is a ton of fun, and nitro gives you a feeling and a sound and a smell you just can't get anywhere else. Electric is great, electric is better in most ways, but when you have a real engine making real engine noises in your RC car, it's really hard to beat. I did have to go ahead and change over to some different tires. The tires that came with it had some pretty bad flat spots on it and just were not working well, but these backflip LPs work really well. Get a bigger jump there. I love seeing the trail of smoke in the air. Go the other way. Yeah! The suspension on these Revos out of the box is really great, especially when you're not going super fast. I usually don't go crazy fast with my nitros, just because it's a nitro and it's a different kind of fun from an electric. If I want absolute maximum top speed, I'm going to grab one of my electric cars anyway. This is more about the full experience of nitro, and we are definitely getting that full experience here. I will say part of my normal nitro experience is never really running the body. I tend to run without the body most of the time just because you're always looking at things, you're always tuning things. Of course, you can put the body on if you want, and if you're going to be spending a bunch of time upside down, it's not a bad idea because you can end up popping the air filter off if you don't. But I normally run with my body off most of the time. Like I said, this thing's running really well. It is still pretty rich. But as you can see, we've got a nice trail of blue smoke coming out of the back.
It's idling well. It's staying relatively cool. It's pretty hot out here today, so it's going to be a little bit hotter than it normally would if you had like 70-degree temperatures. But overall, she feels really, really nice. And I'm having an absolute blast with this thing. One more jump. Ah, you cannot beat the sound and smell.
Now, unfortunately, once the bashing is done, the fun isn't quite done because there's some things you need to do to your engine to make sure it'll run the next time. Before we talk about that though, if you're having fun in this video, make sure you get subscribed and hit that bell to get notified of future videos because we've got some projects coming up that are going to be absolutely wild and you're not going to want to miss it. When you're done bashing, after run oil is going to be your friend. Unfortunately, nitro can be corrosive, so if it sits in the engine for too long, it can actually damage it. Just like with the Traxxas method, I always recommend pinching off the inlet fuel to the carb to kill the engine when you're done. That way it runs as much of the fuel out of the engine and the carburetor as possible, so there's less chance of that corrosion happening. But especially if you're not going to be using the truck for a few days or more, you want to go ahead and pull the glow plug out. You can use one of these cross wrenches down in there to pull it out. Make sure you blow in here first to get any debris out of there. Then you're going to run a few drops of this after run oil into the engine and spin the engine over to circulate it throughout. You can then put your glow plug in and put it on the shelf. Now with that being said, the best recommendation I can give you is make sure you run your nitros as frequently as possible. Just like any engine, nitro engines hate to sit. And if you let your nitro truck sit for too long, you're going to end up having to pull the carburetor off, rebuilding it, cleaning things, replacing lines. If you run it fairly frequently, like every few weeks or every month or so, that probably won't happen. That's all the nitro knowledge I have to give to you. If you want some more knowledge, why don't you look at one of these videos?